Good evening, and welcome to Barbados Decides, the conversation. I'm Stetson Babb. Tonight we tackle some of the issues that matter most to Barbadians: the economy, the cost of living, and the state of crime and safety in our communities. Our panel will explore options, the data, and the commitments ahead of the February the 11th general election. And joining us for this discussion, the economist and candidate for the constituency of St. John and the representative of the People's Coalition for Progress, Mr. Kemar Stewart, the former government senator and Minister of Energy and Business Development, and the representative for the Barbados Labour Party, Lisa Cummins, the attorney at law and the St. Philip North candidate for the Friends of Democracy, Anya Lord.
Good evening, thank you.
And of course, the man with the stats and our resident political analyst, Peter Wickham of Cadres.
Thank you, good to be here.
An important note before we start. The Democratic Labour Party, DLP, was indeed invited to send a representative to participate in this program, but they have not done so. And now to our panelists and our discussion. Well, Barbadians have indeed been navigating a high cost of living while seeking sustainable economic growth. Rising prices and import dependence are all part of everyday life. Tonight we ask how each party will relieve pressure on households while securing economic stability. And Mr. Stewart, you have the honor of starting off. What immediate actions will your party take within its first year in office to reduce the cost of living?
Yes. Well, good night to you, sir, and good night to the entire panel. I am glad to be here to represent the People's Coalition for Progress. Now, you asked what are our proposals, what are our ideas for tackling the cost of living. So we had 5 initial ideas to tackle the cost of living in Barbados. Idea number 1 would be that during the COVID period, upon instruction from government, many persons could not afford and they did not pay water bills, therefore running into arrears. Identifying that, recently the General Manager of the Barbados Water Authority issued a statement indicating that we were at least $100 million in arrears in between commercial and domestic customers. So the People's Coalition for Progress is saying, if you do the analysis and the statistics, that's approximately about $65 million for domestic households where people we're dealing with. So we are saying that if garbage and sewage tax makes $80 million a month and we're making $560 million in primary surplus, that we can afford to write off the arrears owed to the Barbados Water Authority for domestic household and to remove that noose around the necks of the people. Idea number 2 quickly would be total VAT reform, not just a reduction but reform altogether. We had the writing off of at least $1.6 billion in VAT and income tax upon the emergence of the government. So clearly there is scope for reform of collection of the VAT, paying over the VAT into government, and measures needed to enforce non-payment from businesses for the VAT. Another idea would be the reduction of the garbage and sewage tax, and also rerouting the tax back to the consolidated fund that we can actually track and trace how much it makes. And lastly, during the month of December, we identified a large volume of barrels coming through the ports. So what we are saying is we want to offer for the month of December import and duty-free for the month of December in Barbados for the people of this country.
Thank you. Ms. Lord of Friends of Democracy, Mr. Stewart has outlined a series of measures to tackle the cost of living. How would your party approach that particular issue?
Yes, good evening once again. First and foremost, food security is high on our agenda. The cost of living affects families at an economic level. And so one of the first things that we're going to do is have food parish centers in all 11 parishes on the island. And in those centers, there will be an expanded range of essential items that persons can purchase that will not have value-added tax attached to it, which makes obtaining food and other essential items more affordable for the average Barbadian. Secondly, we have proposed a VAT reduction policy. We know that VAT is collected at different points on the island, at the port of entry. We pay it again when we go into the supermarket. So we are going to look at removing VAT at other points of sale and collecting VAT at the ports only. Of course, we have proposed that that VAT will also be reduced to about 16.5% or so from 17.5%. Lastly, we have to be honest with each other. We need economic resilience within the households. And to build economic resilience, we have to educate the persons, the families. So what we're going to look at doing is getting into the communities at the constituency level, providing training for families, not just skills-based training, or not just opening up opportunities for employment, but engaging them in discussions about financial security, how to build generational wealth, training in financial literacy, so that we build economic resilience from the ground up and not just rely on the government to provide the cushion that they need.
Ms. Cummins, we've heard from the coalition and from the Friends of Democracy a series of approaches, including tackling, reducing taxes, food security. What would be the BLP's approach?
So, good night, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting us to be here. And I want to thank the other members of the panel for the comments which they've made so far. As it relates to the Barbados Labour Party, obviously we have been the government for the last several years, and so the balance has to be about what we have already done and what we're proposing to do if the public chooses the Barbados Labour Party in the next election on February 11th. So let's start first with what we have already done. I heard the comments about removing VAT at different points, but a number of items are already VAT-free. In Barbados, there is the basic basket of goods, which are the necessities, and they range from food items, fruit items, sanitary products, cleaning items. Even during COVID, these were the basic basket of goods to which VAT is not already applied. And so that continues. In the last budgetary statement issued by Ryan Stroud as the Minister of the Ministry of Finance, that basket was further extended. So you've got about 300 items already which are VAT-free. So that's not a new thing, that's already in place. The second thing is that we have already introduced a number of measures as it relates to freight, capping the freight rates at 2019 prices. And why is that even important? In 2019, right before the pandemic started, we saw that we had the freight rates at one level. But during the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, we saw those freight rates skyrocket. The lowest average inflation of freight rates ranged from around 150% to as high as 500%. So we predated that impact on freight rates by capping it at 2019 levels. That has already been done. We've already also introduced a number of measures under the Miscellaneous Controls Act where we monitor those prices. There was the prices compact that capped already on top of the VAT rates, then ensured that the markups were capped at 12.5% before, so that they didn't get as high as they were before. So we've already done a lot. But then in the manifesto for the Barbados Labour Party, which we have already launched, we've introduced a number of additional measures. And what would they be? They include things ranging from protection for the most vulnerable households, low-income earners, pensioners, persons with special needs, persons with disabilities. There's already the reverse tax credit that is in place. We've now proposed further extending that. We've included a number of additional categories for persons, a cost of living credit for those categories that I just mentioned. So we've not just already started the work, we've continued the work and we've costed it. And I want to take a moment very briefly to speak about the question of removing the VAT or even lowering the VAT. And I've started out quickly already by saying that we've already removed that on food items. The amount of revenue that the government generates from VAT on an annual basis pays the bills for the very things that our colleagues have said that they want to be able to do.
The other panelists a chance. We also want to balance the time everyone.
Absolutely.
Allow everyone to
Sure.
be on for a while. And especially you spoke historically about what you've done, and we surely want to
That's
hear
fair.
more about what you plan to do.
Yep.
I want to give the panelists a chance to respond. And maybe let's start with our pollster and analyst, Peter Wickham.
Right, so I guess the logical question I can respond to is the extent to which the issue of cost of living is relevant in terms of the public's mind. And I can say that with some confidence, it's useful that the panelists and the parties are speaking directly to it because it is a major issue of concern. Since 2008, in public opinion polls, it has consistently been the #1 issue in the minds of Barbadians. And we have essentially been responding to a reality where the cost of living is increasing and people's capacity to cope is essentially linked to the performance of government, or this is the presumption. I do have a bit of difficulty though with that automatic assumption because if I look across the region, I can tell you that polling that we would have done in St. Lucia, polling we would have done in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and certainly United States of America where they frequently publish polling, cost of living is the #1 issue on the minds of people, that and jobs and so on. And in many instances you can see a change of government and you can see the retention of a government in many of those instances that I have given. So I think that is, yes, I would agree the cost of living is high. And then I think that it's also important to us to realize that while it is high, it need not necessarily mean an indictment on the government, although it could possibly be an indictment on the government. So that's probably the most balanced perspective that I would give. And the ideas are interesting, you know, the linking of VAT to the cost of living. Again, another popular perception, the belief that because we're paying VAT on something, that makes it expensive. And then the alternative idea, which has been advanced by Lisa, about the extent to which there are other factors, such as transportation and whatnot, that have to be considered.
I want to raise another aspect because, of course, in relation to the cost of living, inflation is going to be a critical factor. And that's, of course, the rate at which prices, the cost of a range of goods and services rises. How would you address, and I speak to the panelists, wages, of course, is a matter of the capacity of individuals to be able to afford based on their own income. How would you address the whole issue of wages or earnings versus the cost of living? You're nodding first, maybe Ms. Cummins, you want to start off on that?
Sure. You know, I remember sometime during the course of last year, especially with security guards, there was this very first early conversation around what is a decent minimum wage for persons earning at the lowest income level. And the government at that time, in extensive negotiations, struck started the discussion around what that needed to look like. And then you saw the establishment of that minimum wage because people have to be able to live, right? People have to be able to have an income that allows them to meet their basic needs. And so the government then undertook, and you've seen minimum wages go from a minimum wage being set now to being at $10.71 per hour for those lowest income earners, but also indexed now to inflation at 2% on an annual basis. So that has been something that the government has been very proud of being able to do for those lowest income earners around us. And we haven't been able to see any other administration do that so far.
Ms. Lord, we're the friends of democracy too within the government. How would you address this issue, wages versus inflation and the cost of living?
Well, like I said earlier, first let me say that I've heard Ms. Cummins and I've heard what Peter said. And I accept that there are aspects that impact the cost of living that we just don't have control over. Yes. I also accept that there are a number of items that already have VAT removed from them, which make them more affordable. And I do accept that we see that the government has put things in place to increase the minimum wage to make persons more comfortable. But the fact is that we live in a reality where this assistance and these increases do not meet the pace at which the cost of living is rising. Yeah. And the fact is that there's only so much that any administration will be able to do. So especially as a person who works directly with families on the ground, my thing is that we have to step back from this very traditional approach of the government facilitating more than it can or hanging its hat too high and get into the communities to help build economic resilience from the ground up. For example, we focus a lot on skills training and skills development, but we don't focus on opening up opportunities for Barbadians, especially young persons who want to be able to earn an income. We have several persons within the communities who are entrepreneurs. They run small businesses from their homes. What are we doing to assist them to expand those businesses and even increase exporting their products?
Let's give Mr. Stewart a chance to weigh in on this issue.
Yes, well, the facts remain is that we are 3 IMF programs in. No. If you listen to the comments of the governor of the central bank, he constantly says in every report that the government benefited from what you call the inflation dividend. So high taxation will create high inflation in the economy. So therefore, the taxes that were put on the country during the BERT program, sewage tax, taxes at the pump, the health levy, now you have the resilience tax. So these different taxes are creating a higher cost of living for the country. And as taxation grows, government revenue would increase in terms of what the government takes in, because taxation is charged as a percentage of price. Now, Ms. Cummins mentioned about the price compacts. Now, all the price compacts failed by admission of the Minister for People Empowerment, right? And you had to be going over them, and the private sector indicated that they have no interest in facilitating further the price compacts. So notwithstanding the fact that we are in a global environment where we are a price taker, we import oil, and therefore there's only so much that the government could do given the fact that these global circumstances, wars, rumors of wars in the Middle East, will impact on how much fiscal space the government has to offer the people.
We get a perspective from Peter Wickham. We've heard of it.
Yeah, I mean, again, another important issue, the wages factor, and the extent to which wages are important. And again, I think that people generally feel that they're not earning enough, and that the cost of living could be helped if you were earning more. So I think the parties are definitely spot on in terms of focusing on this issue and ways of trying to alleviate, to get more money in people's pockets by way of a direct transfer. There's a disconnect, however, and this is the relationship between the wages and also inflation, and the presumption that increased wages are not in and of itself an inflationary facility. I'm not convinced that the public understands that there's a relationship between more money and an increase in the cost of living and an increase in inflation. And I do feel that parties have to walk that line relatively carefully, because if you do push wages up too quickly, it will have, essentially it will be almost evening out in terms of the cost of living, and it will drive inflation for sure. Yeah.
Mr. Stewart, you referred to the issue of imported inflation, I believe, and of course that has impact for the cost of food here. How would your party address the whole issue in relation to cost of living? Or how would you address the issue of the cost of food prices?
Well, first and foremost, I think we need to pursue an aggressive agriculture strategy to help cut food imports on one perspective. Also, I think we need partners, and Ms. Cummins as Minister of Energy would appreciate this. We need other partners as it relates to where we get oil from, diversifying our oil sources. Right now, you know what is happening in Venezuela. Barbados approached the idea once upon a time of having a Petro-Caribbean deal where you would have purchased oil directly from Venezuela and many other Caribbean countries. Now that America has taken, somewhat an interest in it, we have to gauge and scope what the future of the Caribbean is going to look like as it relates to oil imports.
That's oil, but we're talking specifically more though about food and how we address that issue.
But if you cut the price of oil, you could cut the price of food, right? So
you want to expand on how you do that?
Well, to transport the food here, oil is required to, one, power the boats and to do everything that you need to do. So if you could cut that cost, you could substantially allow...
Right, so the cost of transportation reduces, therefore the cost of importation might be affected with that as well. I want to get back though then to Ms. Cummins, your party's approach to this whole issue of food prices and the cost.
So one of the things that we've started to do already has been to look at the diversification of our import markets. And you've seen at least 2 missions find their way down into the hemisphere. The southern part of Brazil, we've engaged with Roraima in Brazil, looking at import diversification there. We've been using even more over the last 2 years, I want to say in particular, but certainly the last several months, our European Union relationships under the Economic Partnership Agreement, but also looking at the diversification of our relationships. And what we have seen for sure has been that the balance between national food security, the investment in our domestic agricultural production, diversification into the shade houses and so on, vertical farming, investment into 6-week crops to be able to ensure that those things that can be grown locally, we're ramping up production, the feed program nationally as well, the investment in the dairy and in the pork industry to grow those sectors domestically while diversifying our trading markets. That's been a huge part of Barbados' strategy, and the expectation is that a Barbados Labour Party government, with the permission of our people, would continue along that pathway, building on our existing relationships but diversifying into new ones as well.
Ms. Laura, the issue here then is stabilizing food prices and
Yeah.
strengthening local production. How would Friends of Democracy approach that?
As Kimar mentioned it briefly, and as Ms. Cummins said, our party too will look at aggressively investing in our local agricultural sector and strengthening and diversifying that sector. We're going to look at more sustainable farming, in some cases organic farming. We're going to look at different types and methods of farming. What we also want to do though is, again, get back to educating the public so that persons want to purchase more from local farmers. Persons feel comfortable purchasing more from local farmers, and thus reducing this expectation or this belief that we need to take foreign products or that foreign products are better.
Mr. Wickham, a key point there is the heavy reliance on food imports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, a popular issue with voters, there is a perception among voters that the best way to address this issue is to grow local agriculture. And it was interesting that two of the parties of the three focus heavily on agriculture. Certainly Friends of Democracy has a strong position, which is something that I respect because it is popular and it is something that people respond to well. What I don't think that people will respond to well is the extensive concessions and subsidies to the agricultural sector that are not necessarily benefiting us in terms of reducing the food import bill, because agriculture can consume quite a bit. So that's something that has to be watched. The other point I wanted to make is that I look at a country like Bermuda, which is it is more a personal issue for me, has no food insecurity and also has no agriculture. They import everything that they need and they have sufficient resources to do that. They were also not impacted during COVID to any significant extent because they had enough money to bid for what they want. And I always ask myself, why do we assume that food insecurity has to be addressed by agriculture? Because the Bermuda model demonstrates that there's really no relationship between the two. What they have is no agriculture, but they have a very high level of food security because they have been able to use their land to generate considerable wealth alternatively. This is something that I haven't seen any of the parties speak to, and I think that there definitely is a reliance on agriculture, which is a popular view locally.
Let's turn to now to the critical issue of jobs and growth. And I put this to all the parties and to our analysts as well. Which sectors of the economy will your party prioritize for job creation? Ms. Cummins.
So I think one of the things that we've been very proud of has been the level of unemployment that we've achieved so far. It's been a historic low of unemployment, but that doesn't mean that there is still not unemployment. And one person looking for a job is perhaps too many in our economy. And so that means that this Barbados Labour Party has rolled out a series of initiatives so far and intends to roll out some more even more going forward. What are some of those things that we have done so far? One, we have invested heavily in things like the construction gateway, so that for the construction sector that we're able to generate new jobs as a result of having skills developed to service that job. We've done so in the agricultural sector, we've done so in food sciences, and we're doing so now in life sciences. We've done so in robotics, and we're doing so in artificial intelligence. And so the balance between what people see as the traditional sectors as well as the new emerging technology-driven digital sectors and those that are based on a knowledge-based economy, that's very heavily been the focus of us blending education and education transformation between sectoral development and job creation. Youth, as well as retraining those areas that have historically been in traditional areas that are now being repurposed in new areas that may emerge as we evolve.
The coalition, first of all, Ms. Cummins stressed the issue of the low unemployment. Are you comfortable with those figures?
No, I beg to differ on the low unemployment, because if you look across the unemployment sphere of Barbados, there's a diversification happening, opening up a liberalization of job markets. So you had the emergence of the Caribbean community, changes to the freedom of movement, free skills. You had at least 2 or 3 amendments before the signature of the 4 Caribbean countries to the freedom of movement, which freed up so many categories of new workers to come into Barbados. We're also seeing persons coming from the African market, Ghana. We're seeing doctors coming in from Cuba. So with the emergence of these new trends happening in the labor market, many Barbadians are feeling isolated from work. So what we are saying as a coalition is that we want to focus on the future of work. And the future of work is basically in the orange economy, which is on the technology and the digital side. So down to the smallest babe, 3 years old, 4 years old, can use a cell phone, a tablet, and technology. So we can clearly see that that is the direction we are going. So we are saying that we would fully monetize all social media pages and allowed Barbadians to be paid to find work within the digital realm. And it just takes a government decision, engaging with the technology giants around the world to make it happen. It happens around many countries, and that is where we're looking to go as a coalition.
Ms. Cummins seems to suggest or hint that it may be a bit more complex than that.
I would say it's definitely a lot more complex than that. When you talk about monetization of social media spaces, that's very much in the realm of intellectual property, and there's only one country in the region, regrettably, that has been able to plug into that space because they have been included in the Global North's repositioning of, around intellectual property and social media monetization. And Barbados has been working through our intellectual property and through our online technology partners to be able to ensure that Barbadians can do that. But it certainly is not as simple as waving a magic wand and hoping that it just happens. And I'm sure that, Kimar, you must know that.
Yeah.
We need to give Friends of Democracy a chance to state their job creation strategy.
Yes, I find the question of low unemployment to be quite interesting, because depending on which sector you look at, you know that there's saturation of some industries. So you have persons who are well qualified, but the industry itself just doesn't have the capacity to take in all of those persons who are qualified to work there. Then on the other hand, you have a large group of people who are not as skilled, and therefore who can't find work beyond a certain level or a certain standard. What I will say though is that Friends of Democracy is looking heavily into a more, what I would say, untraditional approach. So we know that we have the cultural industries and we have the sports industry. We have a lot of talent in both industries. And what we are looking at doing is investing more in those industries, creating more jobs in those industries, and getting out of this idea that you have to have employment here in Barbados. If you have talent, if you have a skill, and you can use it overseas or you can be paid elsewhere, we encourage you to go out and do that. If we can open up the avenues and the opportunities for you to do that, then we also do that. Because we know what happens when a lot of people move on and work outside of the jurisdiction, remittances come home. So that's one of the things that we're looking at.
Some of our panelists might tell you that suggestions about seeking opportunities through migration have been fairly controversial. Do you want to weigh in on that, Peter, and then Ms. Cummins?
Yeah, I mean, the migration conversation is controversial. I do think that in this instance, some of the opposing parties have read the room incorrectly. Barbadians, by and large, based on my own assessment and reading, are excited about the idea of greater integration and also the ability for us to move out. I don't get the impression that the non-BLP parties have responded as well as they could. and in a sense alienated potential people coming into Barbados in the belief that they don't support them. So my sense is that there was an opportunity that was missed in that regard. As far as employment is concerned, I do accept that we have a relatively low level of employment, largely driven by the construction sector. Historically, construction has been the area that we have looked at in terms of absorbing jobs, either directly or indirectly. But what I think is exciting now is that I've heard all three parties represented here today speak to knowledge-based and orange economy, which is a new and an emerging area, and an area that I think a lot of Barbadians are happier to work in, along with the traditional tourism and so on.
That's a nice segue into the other topic, which is youth employment, youth and employment. So, and I'll go now to Ms. Cummins. So, what are the strategies and policies of your party for reducing youth unemployment and ensuring young Barbadians can have build a sustainable future and careers here at home? Because we talked about migration, but careers here at home.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Barbados has an aging population, but we also have a young population that's vibrant and thriving in a lot of ways and eagerly looking for opportunities. And as we segue out of the earlier question, we're also seeing in that younger demographic those who prefer the gig economy. And so you've seen that Barbados has had a number of young people who don't necessarily want to have the traditional approach to work that my generations, that's maybe even yours, may have had. They want to be able to move from place to place and do thing to thing, one thing to the other. And we have been able to inbuild the environment, the facilitating environment to have that happen across all sectors, the gig economy, being able to train in the emerging sectors that have been of interest to young people, and I mentioned some of them earlier. And if I can link that back with our support for them wanting to be their own bosses and not necessarily wanting to work for someone else, that's where funds like the trust funds, trust loans have come in, and we've seen a significant number of young people tapping into that. And we've seen that people have gone into untraditional areas there as well. $10,000 being able to borrow to be able to start your own business. We've just announced in our manifesto last night that we will be increasing that to $20,000. That's a big deal, especially for young people who want to be their own bosses.
For the interest of Mr. Stewart, the Coalition on Reducing Youth Unemployment?
Yes. Well, we had an announcement where government intended to establish something called a Jobs and Investment Committee, specifically with a mandate of bringing 20,000 jobs. This is when former Prime Minister Owen Arthur was alive. This committee had the former Finance Minister, Mr. Chris Sinclair, as well. Now, the public sector has been a place that Barbadians found work traditionally. And the growth of the public sector have absorbed so many Barbadians into work where the private sector just don't have the capacity or they're willing to take the risks in terms of hiring, especially without traditional government support or incentive. So what we've recognized right now is that we have an aging public service. Right? There are many persons who would love to come out for early retirement. So what we wish to do as a coalition is to engage and run some numbers as to a possible total that we can offer a segment of the population in the public service early retirement payouts, allow them to go on and enjoy retirement, and specifically target persons below a age demographic to usher them into the public service, into government service, because they have way more years to put in and to contribute. It would lower the youth unemployment. It would also replenish the national insurance fund as well, and it would allow the public service to innovate by having new ideas which could mesh with the experience that we have right now.
Ms. Laura, the Friends of Democracy agree with that approach, or what would be your alternate strategies for addressing youth unemployment?
Well, one of the first places that we would start is with the diversification of the educational system, right? We have to recognize that the old model is failing, has been failing for some time. We need to not only just focus more on skills and skills-based training, but we also have to start meeting the youth where they are. We have to start meeting them at the things that they're interested in getting into. We see, for example, I know that Ms. Cummins mentioned the issue of intellectual property when it comes to the online when it comes to the online businesses. But the fact is that we have several young people in Barbados who have built careers and who are earning, I say cautiously, a significant income through online businesses, not just in some cases catering to the domestic market only, but they're exporting their products. So entrepreneurship is also something that we're going to focus heavily on. And we too have a policy where we will be offering grants and loans to persons to facilitate building their businesses.
That segues into the whole issue of small business generally and the support for that. Ms. Cummins?
Well, now you're in my wheelhouse because I've spent the last few years as Minister with responsibility for small business. So, yeah, absolutely. We have seen that in the last 7 years since we established the trust loans in 2018, we have been able to loan close to $25 million to over 5,700 small businesses. And we've been able to provide that at an interest rate that is below what the bank typically would have, around 5.5% at the highest. And in the case of Trust of Fund Access has loaned around $75 million to be able to ensure that persons are able to create their businesses. And that trends across youth, women, men, persons who have been formerly incarcerated who are looking for a new chance. So we've absolutely been able to provide both the financing and making sure that it is affordable. And we've integrated business development support so we can now move even further. And then if, as Claude...
Let's speak to those strategies you spoke about, you've done. How will you evolve or advance those strategies?
So now we are going to be moving even further into that space by providing a dedicated business development support accelerator to be able to help those businesses grow. What we've seen is that too many businesses don't grow at scale. They start small, they remain small. We want to be able to help them to grow. So we've now launched a primary, nursery, enhanced, and advanced stage of business development, pairing them with investors. You've seen that we launched the Junior Stock Exchange in Barbados for the first time, and a second country in the region to have done that. We did that in November last year, and we've been able to see over 400 companies sign up to be able to be in that space, and we're advancing that going forward with 75 companies onboarded.
Mr. Wickham, how do these issues weigh on the minds of the electorate? Issues of youth employment or youth unemployment? The small business sector?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big issue, and what's interesting is always when people rate education, usually that's one of the higher rated or better rated sectors of the economy, or sectors of performance for all governments. This is across the board, compared to youth issues, which tend to be rated very poorly, but there's an intersection that is not properly understood. And I was particularly keen on hearing mention on the panel that the political parties are looking at small business development, and essentially moving the concept of a side hustle into the more legitimate space and accepting that a lady who bakes sweet bread actually works. And we've often found that we will ask her if she's employed, and she would say no. But technically speaking, she is. So it's a perception issue, and I think it's great that all of the parties represented here today seem to be saying we need to start speaking to that and legitimizing the types of small business, whether it's a gig economy or alternatively food preparation or whatever, to be part of our concept of what work is and to help it work better.
There's also a question, how do we integrate those activities, individuals, into the formal economy? It also brings us to the issue of government finances and public sector finances, and that's the issue of then of public debt. How we manage that. Mr. Stewart referred to the issue of the public sector as a source of employment and providing early employment, retirement rather, for some state employees to bring on others, which has again implications for government's finances from many perspectives. So let's look at this issue of government's finances, managing the state purse, and let's also factor in how we manage the state's debt profile. Mr. Stewart.
Yes, debt will be a constant for almost every economy unless you're extremely wealthy and you have the resources to sit on and stand on and spend. So you have to borrow as a small open economy. However, with debt comes discipline though, to ensure that your debt dynamics and your economic indicators don't go out of whack. So
do you think the government has been disciplined in this regard?
I think the government has been excellent at extracting revenue from taxation. Where I think the government fell down is their inability to cut expenditure across government. Expenditure cuts across government will be an unpopular decision because there will be job losses, there will be
So speak to that. How would you address that?
How would they address the
How would the
issue of
question- yeah.
job losses?
Cutting government expenditure.
Well, see, there's something basically called like the mall effect. So in government, the public service, our public service generates significant amount of spend in terms of the public servants. Whenever they're paid, they go and they spend, so that generates economic activity for the country. Now, it becomes a sacrifice for the country to maintain employment above a certain level, right? Because if you have it at a certain level, you're guaranteed to achieve a certain level of output and result. So if we have to continue to borrow to a point to maintain the public service because it generates a certain level of spend, which keeps people employed and which keeps small businesses receiving funds, we have to do it, right? It becomes a sacrifice. No, we have to do it. We can't do it. But in the context of an IMF program, no, where you're kind of forced to take those measures because you borrow the money, is a very thin line you have to walk as a government. So you have to be truthful with the people and to say, look, this state-owned enterprise is financially in the red, is so far deep that we cannot continue to do this. And have a truthful conversation with the people as it relates to how you wish to proceed with the particular changes and restructurings to the SOEs. National conversation is what we need, and I believe the people will understand, even if there are some casualties along the way.
Ms. Lord? Mr. Stewart has spoken about his concern is managing public debt, managing government's expenditure and expenses, and he's proposed a look at reducing public expenditure. How would Friends of Democracy approach that issue? Of course, it's all having a national conversation, maybe with hard decisions that you have to make, correct?
Yes. What I would say is that if you keep doing the same thing the same way all the time, you're going to get the same results. Friends of Democracy is not the first party to speak about diversification within the local...
But explain that concept. What do you mean by diversification of, well, in that context?
Yes, so for example, we've been heavily focused on tourism. We can look at expanding, if we look at tourism as a traditional income earner, how do we expand on that, for example, to get into cultural tourism, to get into sports tourism? We have a manufacturing industry that can be expanded, that can be developed. I think that we tend to focus too much on doing the same thing the same way all the time, and it causes us to have to borrow unnecessarily. One of the things that we have to recognize is, yes, we will need assistance, as Kimar has said. Our debt right now is very high, and it is going to be generations down the road that has to repay that money, not necessarily us. So we have to look at how what we are doing is going to impact those coming behind us.
And the Friends of Democracy would do, therefore, what?
So as I said, we're going to focus on diversification of different sectors. Again, as I said, we look at tourism. We can diversify the tourism sector to increase revenue there. We have a budding manufacturing.
We diversify the tourism sector, huh?
Yes, because we have cultural tourism.
Okay.
Persons are interested in, I'm not sure what the correct word is, but persons who travel to have
experiences.
Experiences, yes, but there's a specific term. Is slipping me right now. Environmental kind of.
Leisure.
Pardon?
Leisure tourism.
Digital nomads?
Pardon?
The digital nomads?
It's going to come back to me. It's going to come back to me. But there are different types of tourism that you could focus on expanding and opening up the market. You're getting people who are interested in just more than coming to see sea and sand. I should put it that way.
Right. So I'm going to get to give Ms. Cummins a chance to weigh in. But your fundamental issues in terms of your approaches to the debt is because if you expand, if you diversify and expand your economy and earnings, therefore you'll be able to reduce your reliance on that.
Yes, you bring more income into the economy.
Ms. Cummins.
So let's start perhaps by going to the numbers and the facts. When we came to office in 2018, the debt to GDP ratio was close to 180%. We've seen in the last reports of the governor and the central bank earlier this year and just a few days ago that we are just under 100%. So debt to GDP has been on the decline in the last 7 years under this administration's leadership, and that is notwithstanding increased expenditure during the course of COVID, reduced revenue during that period as well, and the increased expenditure on unfortunate events like ashfall and so on. In terms of social spending, what I'd like to be able to understand is we've added the One Family program, we've added support for pensioners by increasing the level of pensions, we've expanded the social care infrastructure. So we've been able to reduce the debt despite the concerns about Barbados' debt profile, while still increasing our provision of social support. And there was a mention about the public service. The public service, we have seen a reduction in the transfers to state-owned enterprises while right-sizing those state-owned enterprises. And we've had a number of amalgamations and consolidations over the last 7 years. And so there's no question in my mind that this government has been responsible and fiscally disciplined in its management of the economy, and we have expanded our social safety net, which is very much a part of who Barbados historically has been. And perhaps if Kimara can tell us, who would you send home? In 2018, we had a former governor of the central bank who at the time proposed to send home over 4,000 people. We haven't done that. So where would you begin to make those cuts?
I want to ask.
Are you?
Sorry.
The question's asked.
Sorry.
Mr. Stewart, go ahead. Before you come, let Mr. Stewart respond.
Kimara respond to the question first.
Well, see, it's not my responsibility at this time to identify who I would send home, right? But the issue of the debt decreasing is not an accurate statement. Now, if debt to GDP was 175% in 2018, the overall debt to GDP today is lower. Yes, debt to GDP. However, overall public debt today is significantly higher than it was in 2018. Now, when we came to office, public debt was thereabouts, at the base was like $12 billion, along with outstanding arrears, which were about 3 or 4 additional billion, which was added on to that. We had the debt restructuring. Right? People were hurt during that restructuring. The banking system was hurt. Investors were hurt during that time, and people experienced significant loss. Right? Fast forward to today, where public debt is growing, especially external debt to the international world, to the international institutions. The country has to pay significantly more money in interest. Right? So we have $2 billion in interest payments issued in the last governor of the central bank's report last week or so. The more money we pay in interest, the less money we have for the social programs and social spending, etc., etc. So cuts will come, they have to come.
You have to move on to some other segments, but I want to give Ms. Lord a chance to respond, and we want to get to Peter.
Yes, I was just going to quickly say, I'm putting the question of that aside. The expansion of the social services, as Ms. Cummins spoke about, that may be true on paper, yes. But the reality is when you look on the ground, when you look at the living circumstances of families on the ground, we're not seeing it translating into the homes. So I do think that we need to revisit how we practically expand and provide for families who are vulnerable and who need assistance.
Mr. Bickham.
This issue of debt is a highly technical one, and I have to admit it's not one that appeals to the broad cross-section of Barbadians who may comment in a public opinion poll or whatnot. It's not something that keeps people up at night. If you borrow money to buy a bus, I think the voter is more concerned about the availability of that bus to get to work efficiently, and less concerned about the ability of their children to pay this loan going forward. While I appreciate that that second part is important in terms of a technical analysis of the economy, I get a sense that most Barbadians are happy to leave that to politicians to determine. Their main interest is, how do you get that facility that I need available to me when I need it, and improve services that can be provided. And I think that the question of how is it always going to be paid for is less of a perennial concern that keeps people up at night.
I just want to remind our viewers, we're going to look at the critical issues that are some of the critical issues that are occupying attention during this election campaign. We have panelists from the Barbados Labour Party, from the Coalition Party, and from the Friends of Democracy, as well as our resident analyst, Peter Bickham. This is Barbados Decides, the conversation. And when we come back, a look at crime, justice, and social stability. Good evening and welcome back to Barbados Decides, the conversation. We're looking at a number of the critical issues that are occupying attention on the campaign trail during this election campaign. And with us to discuss a variety of issues, we have representatives from several of the major parties. We have economists and the candidate for the constituency of St. John for the People's Progressive Party, Keemar Stewart. We have the former government senator and the Minister of Energy and Business Development, Ms. Lisa Cummins, representing the Barbados Labour Party. And we also have attorney and the St. Philip North candidate for the Friends of Democracy, Ms. Anya Lord, along with our resident analyst, Mr. Peter Wickham. Again, must stress, the Democratic Labour Party, they were invited to send a representative to this program, and they have not done so. On this segment, let's look at safety and justice. How they shapes Barbadians' quality of life. Crime affects families, investment, tourism, and the public's confidence. And we want to hear from the representatives here, and we'll start with Ms. Cummins. It's a critical issue for the public, and it has occupied, as I said before, a lot of attention on the campaign trail. How is the Barbados Labour Party addressing this?
Absolutely. I think the fact that we have reformed a significant number of our pieces of legislation, especially in the criminal justice space, the Bail Act and so on, introduced witness protection legislation, those are things which we have done, increase the number of judges on the bench, increase the number of members of the team for the prosecution teams. Those are all facts that can't be disputed, but that doesn't mean that the Barbadian in their home tonight doesn't feel unsafe, and we can't minimize that. But what has the Barbados Labour Party also done? We have integrated the relationship between social services and crime, and you've seen that under the Ministry with responsibility for people empowerment, so that the engagement of persons who are vulnerable in communities, that can be mitigated by access to education, access to capacity building, access to training, access to social services. All of that has been done to make sure that you can reduce the symptoms, not just on the other side, but the causes that we also have been seeing coming to the fore. We've created the Crime and Citizen Advisory Council, and that has drawn from a broad cross-section of persons, and we intend to continue that work if we're elected, and you've seen some of the recommendations in our manifesto as well.
Ms. Lord, what do you identify as the main drivers of crime, and what does your party propose to do about it?
Family dysfunction and family instability. Economic security within the home, insecurity, within the home, in my view, or in our view, is one of the main drivers of crime. And so, yes, we've seen welcomed legislative reform that improves the efficiency of the criminal justice system, yes. What we need to see now is more of a stronger approach to dealing with the symptoms, so that we get into the communities more, we get into the homes more, we expand mental health services, we expand education, we expand social services. Because as I said earlier, yes, we do see some assistance coming from these areas, but it is not, the gap between that and the state of the family affairs is very wide.
Mr. Stewart, Ms. Lord spoke about stronger measures, but also community intervention. What would be your approach?
We want to tie economics and crime together. You see the emergence of trends happening in Barbados. Recently, one of the directors of public prosecutions said that we have something in Barbados called hitmen for hire. So there's the emergence of these trends where people are paying people to, remove them from earth. So every year, since 2018, the murder rate has substantially increased every year up till this year. So if we could starve the persons who have the resources, who are facilitating the crime, the importation of guns, the importation of drugs, and these other acts that are going to, these other preparatory acts that involve money that are going to crime, if we can cut that, and that will help to cut out the root cause of crime. So that involves heavy measures, going after the persons that we identify are facilitating it. Also giving the police the necessary resources, and also including the BDF in it as well, not powers of arrest though.
Ms. Cummins looks like she wants to respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've spent a significant amount of money. There's nothing that the Barbados Police Service has asked for that the government has not provided, whether it is equipment, whether it is resources, whether it is additional manpower. We've done that. But I think the primary thing here, and I think that Anya, when she spoke earlier, is where we as a government have been very clear. If a youngster does not feel as though there's an opportunity for him to feel as though he belongs in a society and his home environment and his community, don't make him feel as though there's a positive contribution to be made, then that becomes a part of the problem. That's where the emphasis on social services, education, training, and capacity building has come for this administration.
Peter Wickham, crime and violence was a major slogan in the previous election campaign. How is it shaping up this time?
Crime and violence, yeah. No, we're spot on. Crime and violence and the economy, well, cost of living are number 1 and 2, depending on how you look at it. Generally speaking, what I found is that crime becomes the number 1 issue where the cost of living isn't. So in a sense, people who are better off focus on crime, but regardless, on the ground, it's a main cause of concern. There's a disconnect, however, where, and I think Anya pointed it out well, that Barbadians perceive treatment to crime as policing, locking up, that type of thing. And people have a lot of time for resources going to the police because they want to see more arrests, more detentions, and that type of thing. The conversation about the causes of crime, the root causes, which Anya touched on, is something that is less popular and less politically attractive.
In that case, do you think there's more need for more emphasis on prevention and targeted interventions? Then I want each of the panelists to weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, and I entirely agree. Yeah.
Ms. Laurie?
Yes, I agree. There has to be more emphasis on prevention and targeted intervention.
What would your party do?
Pardon me?
What would your party do?
Well, I always say that community work at the community level has to be an ongoing process. We can't just have a 6-week program or 8-week program, an 8-week program, and say it's successful and then walk away and believe that the work is done. There will always be at-risk youth. There will always be dysfunction of some kind. There will always be a need to provide support at some level, so it has to be an ongoing process.
I see not in agreement from Ms. Cummins.
No, I agree. I mean, this government, certainly under the Barbados Labour Party, has spent a significant amount of time, money, brought persons on board from the churches. I mean, we've talked about, for example, getting young people back into youth groups, getting them back into social clubs, the investment in sporting activity. When people are gainfully engaged and productively engaged, then they don't have time to be caught up in a lot of the other stuff, and when they feel as though there's a return on investment. And that's where we put a lot of resources. By the time people encounter the police, it's problematic. So we very much believe that the peace program and the crime prevention programs, those are critical parts of the strategy for the government of Barbados. The Barbados Labour Party, I should say.
Yes. But I would agree with the government's intention of the peace program. However, the peace program received less than favorable responses from the Attorney General of himself during the estimates presentation, where he indicated that some persons of nefarious character were paid from government coffers. And, they did not like that per se. But the intention of it was good. We're trying to get young people involved in structured programs. So we like that and we support that idea. Now, we would directly give resources to young people, the same way we have crash government programs. We would invest in these programs to ensure that they have the opportunities to have access to a better quality of life.
Mr. Lord, there's also been some critique of the justice system, which has been seen, at least in part at times, too slow, at times too lenient. How would you address that?
Well, that's an interesting topic. Our party has put forward policies on capital punishment and revisiting the question of whether we should re-implement capital punishment. It's not something that we think should be put in place, as I would say, willy-nilly. It will require conversations with all stakeholders, including attorneys at law, the church, and of course mainly from the public. But we do have to look at having punishment that fits the type of crime that is committed. The next thing that we have to look at is rehabilitation. I don't think enough money or time is put into rehabilitation of offenders. A lot of them go into prison, they come out, they reoffend. And that is largely because the programs are not as extensive as they could be.
fixing the justice system?
So I agree. I think one of the early things that the former Attorney General did was to have a dedicated colloquium with the legal fraternity, with the Bar Association, including the criminal bar, to be able to identify what are some of the measures that need to be implemented. What you've seen is that a number of recommendations have already gone before the Bar Association as well as the Law Reform Commission, and a number of those have already been implemented, and you've seen them pass through Parliament. So has there been a series of successful interventions at the level of legislation? Yes, without a doubt. Can the justice system be too slow? The government has put resources around the administration of justice. Now, the question of capital punishment, just for clarity, capital punishment, the mandatory imposition of the death penalty, as you would recall, was removed from our books. And you still have capital punishment on our books, but it just cannot be mandatorily imposed at this point.
Mr. Wickham, how do you detect the public's sentiment, view, feeling for on the approaches so far, and what they really think needs to be done?
No, I mean, I think the public is of the opinion that if we started hanging people, crime would stop. This is not a new thing. This has historically been a challenge, that where you present the kind of questions that Ms. Laura presented, the public's response will always be, we need to start hanging people, and that's the only way that crime will stop. But as Lisa correctly said, there's this perception that people miss that we still have capital punishment in Barbados. So technically speaking, you still can execute people. It's just that it doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. Well, it hasn't happened since the 1980s. So that's where the public is on the issue, but I do think that there is a lot of space for explanations and greater understanding in terms of how the justice system works and the extent to which it takes so long to get people prosecuted.
Mr. This whole issue of just start hanging people, is that too simplistic a response, a knee-jerk response, or how would you approach the issue of tackling the justice system?
Yes, well, I agree that is a simple way to respond to the question. It needs a more in-depth approach to it. So there's this perception that there's two Barbadoses, one for the haves and one for the have-nots. And if you have enough family wealth or status, or if you can, call up a friend and get a favor done, that you can do whatever you want illegally and get off in Barbados. If we can implement reforms to solve those problems, it would definitely increase public confidence as it relates to the justice system. We will also promise things like family courts, gun courts. We will support the idea of the separation of some of these arms to lighten the load on the magistrates, etc. And if we can go that way, they would definitely ease the administration of justice and allow the system to function with lighter loads much more easier.
Lisa Cummins, while indeed the Barbados Police Service has made progress in addressing crime overall, gun crime has increased, and there's significant public concern about that. What would your administration, or does your administration plan to do to address those issues?
So let's start first by saying that when we first came to government in 2018, one of the concerns Kimar just raised was about how guns are getting into the country. Now, guns don't have an expiry date, so guns that are in the country, they're already here. But one of the things that we did, and at the time I was chairman of the Bridgetown Port, we introduced scanners because there were none before. So to make sure that you're able to protect the border, certainly at our ports of entry, from illegal guns coming into the country, we did that. We have also introduced a mechanism where at all of the off-port facilities, that must also be done. And equally, the police have been incredible in solving crime successfully. Something happens today, God forbid, in a couple of days, you're seeing the police having a high rate of resolution of those issues. But we want to be able to focus very heavily on getting in front of the crime, and I think that's where the prevention comes in, and we've done a lot of that, and I've described it already in my earlier presentation.
To the rest of the panel, do you think enough has been done to address gun crime, and what else would you do?
Well, some may say it may not work, but a gun amnesty to the public is a good start.
That has happened. It hasn't worked.
After that, it will be a firm approach to dealing with the trafficking of guns. As I said, wealth is usually tied to crime. So persons who have the wealth to import guns into Barbados, we need to target those persons.
How?
The government is seeking to implement a wiretapping bill, which means that if they suspect persons are involved in the trafficking of guns, that they have all the necessary technology to go after these persons.
Ms. Cummins, you responded to the issue of the gun amnesty.
Yep. So we've seen that has happened. We've had the police service on more than one occasion offer gun amnesty, invite persons over an extended period of time, and then you may net a few guns, yes, but it hasn't terribly been successful. And, you know, the police really have just been making it very clear that they want to focus on prevention and also interdiction after the fact.
And your Lord.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in focusing on prevention. I think the question of how to reduce gun crime and drug-related crime is not an easy one to answer. If it was an easy one to answer, we would be much further along than we are now. What we can say is that we see high levels of dysfunction at the societal level. That's what we can say. We see high levels of dysfunction within the family units. And we have to address that dysfunction. Emotional intelligence, how do you respond when you are offended or annoyed? We have to address those issues if we are going to reduce crime. What I can tell you is that I spoke to a few young children the other day. I asked them what they wanted to become. None of them told me they wanted to be a gunman or a drug man. None of them said that. They all had high hopes for themselves. So clearly something happens between that stage and when they're going to adolescence or adults.
Peter, we had mention of issues such as gun amnesties, going after what people call the big fish, and he's also talking, Ms. Lord has spoken about the prevention issues.
No, I think the best thing I can tell you is that the public generally does not believe enough is being done to deal with the issue of gun crime. I think for many people it is a simple situation of taking guns away from criminals. We don't see that as happening. What I found interesting just now, though, is Kimar's suggestion that the wiretapping bill could have helped, because I got the impression that certainly Kimar's entity didn't support the idea of wiretapping. But it speaks to the challenge that is created when you try to find unusual mechanisms of dealing with a historic problem, because often there's resistance on one side, but yeah, the problem persists.
A not enough mentioned issue that plays into behavior is mental health. How will mental health services be integrated into crime prevention and community safety strategies, Ms. Lord?
I think that's a very interesting question. And the reason why I say that is because from where I sit, we already, within the judicial system, try our best to use the services of psychiatric hospitals, the Thrive Clinic, and even the outpatient clinics at the polyclinic to assist persons who obviously have issues and need help. What I will say is that the mental health sector is overwhelmed. We need to revisit its funding, we need to revisit its capacity, we need to expand the services that it offers.
So, nods. Keymaster?
Yes, but the challenge of mental health needs to be destigmatized first and foremost in Barbados. As soon as you say mental health, somebody can say Jenkins, Black Rock, Madhouse. Right? So we need to evolve the conversation beyond that. So persons may feel a little bit apprehensive about coming forward to deal with the challenge of mental health, but we need to start this education in the schools. We have we call guidance counselors, but we need more than that. We have one guidance counselor in a school for 700 children.
Is the issue of drug use or abuse, is that exacerbating the whole issue of mental health? Ms. Lord?
I would agree. And in fact, again, I'm not a qualified practitioner, but I would also say too that the high levels of drug use that you are seeing sometimes, in my view, are young people self-medicating because they know that they have certain issues and they feel better or are balanced when they use these drugs, and that's what is happening.
More modern drugs, more psychedelic drugs.
No, so I agree 100%. The relationship between drugs, illicit drug use, youth, crime, those things are inextricably linked. And sometimes I'm sure we walk the streets and we see a young man walking and he looks as though he's completely strung out. And when you have these guys who are coming and getting them involved in different kinds of activities, sometimes what you've seen in the system is that they don't even know what they're being asked to do and what they've done after the fact. So drug use and mental health, those are big deals and very much integrated into crime prevention. And so yes, this government over the last 7 years has been able to focus very heavily through the Ministry of Health, through the Ministry of People Empowerment on mental health, and it is expected that we hope to be able to invest even more resources in mental health going forward. And yes, I agree with the question of destigmatization.
Mr. Wickham, we read of a judicial officer speaking of the impact of drug use, and especially so many newer narcotics entering the sphere, on the behaviors of those who perpetrated some of the most heinous crimes. The authorities stress that drug use is not being decriminalized, but is there a perception that among some segments, and has that impacted what is perceived to be an increase in drug use?
Yeah, it's a big issue, and I don't think it's one that we can unpack properly here, but suffice to say, we have moved in the direction of liberalizing ganja use, and I think that there's a difference between ganja and drug use in the broader sense.
And liberalizing versus decriminalizing.
Well,
That's what spoke of perception.
So, and then there's also an acceptance in people's minds that Barbados is now a place where you can use ganja more liberally, which is something that I entirely support. The other side of that, though, is that there are all of these mental health issues that are coming to the fore, which have always been there, but it's now legitimate to speak about them. So if you ask the average person about health and wellness, mental health does not come into it. However, post-COVID, what we have seen is that across the region, governments have accepted that it has to be part of the discussion. You know, we certainly heard it on the panel that it's becoming part of the discussion. The challenge, however, is that within the public's minds, there are a lot of misconceptions. And a lot of people have this automatic assumption that because ganja has been liberalized, we're having mental health issues now that we have to respond to. When the fact of the matter is that use patterns for ganja are probably no different to before. The mental health issues are no different to before, and it's not as easy as saying one equals the other. It's a complicated conversation, as I said, that I don't think we can unpack, but I'm happy that certainly on the panel, there is an appreciation that this issue exists, is something that needs to be tackled, and it is something to some extent that is being tackled.
And I want to lead this off with Peter, the researcher. I want to have ask a broader question. Social stability. Beyond policing, what social policies, education, housing, employment, do the parties see as essential to long-term crime reduction? I'll let the parties weigh in. I'll get a researcher's broad perspective.
No, I mean, if you ask me what is the major issue, I would say education and the extent to which we have a discriminatory educational system that focuses heavily on 11+. To me, that is the basis of a lot of our problems. Does the public of Barbados agree with me? Of course not. I think generally people have compartmentalized the social dislocation in a very different way. And they have all kinds of ideas about what really is the cause. But certainly the family is there, the community. But I think that is probably a bigger player in it than many of the parties might realize. But I'm anxious to hear what they think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I said that we are moving in that direction, in the direction of a more holistic approach to social services. I am eager to see how it is going to, the new policy implemented by the BLP is going to develop. But we definitely need to be in the communities at the ground level more. With respect to education, what I will say is that mental wellness is important. We need to teach coping strategies from a young age. We need to teach what emotional intelligence is, how do you identify your feelings. These are not things that are ordinarily, or have been ordinarily taught to children at a young age. As it relates to employment, we know that disenfranchisement, economic disenfranchisement is an issue. So again, focusing on entrepreneurship, focusing on financial literacy, focusing on building the necessary skills to help generate wealth is going to become important.
Agreed. So I agree. If you looked at the BERT 2026 plan for the Barbados Labour Party in government, it covered many of these issues and identified social stability and a social compact. Even in our manifesto, the covenant with our people, these are some of the key issues, not just in terms of long-term crime reduction as we're discussing here, but in terms of Barbadians feeling a sense of identity. So that's solidly a part of our own agenda, our own persona, our own identity for Barbadians. But here's what I would want to say in closing. The education system, and I think Peter, when he spoke about it earlier, I feel very strongly about this. It has been discriminatory, and we've created first and second class citizens out of our education system, and that makes education sector reform critical. We've started that process. The ministry itself has even been renamed Education Transformation for that very reason. So clearly, this is a party and has been a government that has been committed to that transformation in support of people.
Yes, well, we shouldn't take mental health and turn it into an issue of just people from the lower economic social classes, right? We have people in the upper echelons that go through mental health challenges, but it's not widely spoken about as well. So business stagnation, low productivity, stress, low access to credit, these things stress people out, and these challenges arise. So if we can have that approach where you get early intervention, because they say at least 7 schools, majority of the prison population come from these 7 schools. So if we come back to the primary level and invest right there, that could stem that problem. If we come up and offer support to entrepreneurs and business and people of earning above a certain level, you can also offer interventive measures there as well to stem from the fallout, because in cases where economies are under stress, we need to also take care of the risk takers as well.
This is Barbados Decides, the conversation. And when we come back, some wrap-up thoughts. This is Barbados Decides, the conversation, a discussion on some of the critical issues in this election campaign. Final thoughts from our panelists? Ms. Lord.
The fact is that many Barbadians at the community level feel disconnected from their representatives. Yes, we see benefits at the national level, but they don't feel as though their interests are being represented at the community level. And we in the Friends of Democracy bring practical experience, we bring independent thought, and a deep understanding of what has to happen within the communities and at the family level in order to improve their conditions there. And I am a strong believer that once families thrive and communities thrive at the national level, Barbados will thrive.
Ms. Cummins, do you detect that disconnect?
I feel as though you can't minimize how people feel. And you have to be able to validate those feelings and be in a position to respond to them and meet people where they are. Barbados has had strong governance over the last several years, 7 years in particular. We know what it was to live in a pre-2018 environment, and the Barbados Labour Party has been able to anchor the ship through very difficult and challenging times. If there is a party that has demonstrated its capacity to navigate where the country can go, where it should go, to be able to keep aspirations high, to be able to inspire people both locally at home and in our community, I think it's pretty clear that the Barbados Labour Party has set us a very clear example of what that looks like.
Keemar Stewart, your final thoughts.
Yes, well, we're asking the public to accept a modern approach, a multi-party democracy. The coalition is also open to working with the Friends of Democracy as well in terms of collaboration. So between the two of us, we have at least about 27, 28 candidates, which is almost a full slate. So this modern approach of working together, collaboration, is where we need to go. So you have 3 parties here, the BLP, the coalition, and the Friends of Democracy. The Democratic Labour Party was invited, but as per usual, and Ms. Cummins could attest to this, the leadership of the DLP, often ever present when he was in the Barbados Labour Party, has transferred that same thing.
They're not here to defend themselves, so I don't want to get too much of
yes, but I'm saying the facts remain. We need persons present. We need the leadership present. And basic concepts like this is what we need to move forward.
Final thoughts, Peter Wickham. What struck you most about this particular campaign, and what maybe are some of the issues or factors that we may need to look out for?
This campaign was short and sharp, and I think mercifully short and sharp. It was one of the shortest that
Mercifully,
I've
why?
experienced. Because I think when it drags on a bit, it drags out, and I think it exhausts people. The issues that we dealt with today, I'm happy, are the key issues that are on the minds of voters, even though I accept that the vast majority of Barbadians vote based on party loyalty. So there is a section still of Barbadians who are persuadable. There's a section of Barbadians who are going to listen and wonder what political parties are doing in relation to crime and in relation to the cost of living. And I think that against that background, the conversation that we had today was relatively fruitful, and certainly the platform conversation has for the most part spoken to these types of issues, in addition to all of the personal stuff.
Thank you. Indeed, we want to thank our panelists for the People's Coalition for Progress, Mr. Kemar Stewart, for the Barbados Labour Party, Lisa Cummins, for the Friends of Democracy, Anya Lord, political analyst Peter Wickham, of course, of cadres. Again, we'll note that the Democratic Labour Party, they were invited and they did not send a representative to this particular discussion. Voters have heard commitments, data, discussion. Democracy thrives when citizens engage, ask questions, and demand accountability. Barbados votes soon. Stay with CBC, the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation, for comprehensive coverage of elections 2026. I'm Stetson Babb. Good evening.